Welcome back. So which task was harder? Which one was easier and why? I think you will notice that the task that was actually easiest to do was the second task. The task that actually asked students to synthesize information and make a decision based on that information was actually easier. And the reason for that was because the text itself was easier to read. I don't know about you, but I struggled through reading that first text from the philosophy book. I couldn't restate it in my own words, no matter how many lessons I had around finding main idea or making inference. It wasn't going to help me that much with answering question one. So a whole week's worth of lessons on strategies or on standards would never help a student accomplish that. What would help a student is to know the words that were in that text, some vocabulary work. What would help a student is to understand, where is this sentence from? What kind of book is it? And I gave you a little bit of information. It's from a philosophy book. So if you're in a philosophy class and you happen to know a lot about philosophy and you happen to know a lot about the vocabulary, suddenly reading that very complex text becomes much, much easier. And nothing you teach around main idea or making inferences would ever replace that knowledge and that vocabulary. So the point here in this exercise is skill and strategy instruction will help students, but what will always help students most is having the necessary vocabulary and background knowledge they need to handle the complex texts they will face in their college and careers. And the opportunity is there for us as instructors to take every chance we have to build vocabulary and build world knowledge in our students through instruction, because it's going to be the thing that makes the biggest difference in their reading ability now as adults. So if critical thinking and strategy and standards instruction is not the cause or the solution, let's explore some more. What are other causes? What are other opportunities? We talked very much about vocabulary. We talked a lot already about knowledge. And there's one other cause to this reading gap that we are not going to be able to have a lot of time to talk about today. But I'm sure many of you know it and experience it when you see readers and writers in your classroom. And that is fluency. The ability to read smoothly and efficiently across a page is also a huge reason why students tend to struggle with complex text as the text gets harder and harder. And there are many strategies we can use to build fluency. It's a particular focus for many of you who know or teach adult basic education, that decoding and fluency building is critical. For the purposes of today's conversation, we won't spend any time at all actually on fluency, but I wanted just to acknowledge that that is a huge factor, but that today's talk is really going to focus on the first two, vocabulary and knowledge building. Okay, there's been nearly a century of research pointing to the importance of vocabulary knowledge in students' ability for reading comprehension. And I will just say, look at this. There's starting in 1925, we just got the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress report. So this shows 2013, and just last week, the 2017 results were published. We've got studies from 2012. We've got study after study after study telling us that vocabulary is important. So after much research, after much money spent by a bunch of smart people looking at reading instruction, I'm happy to announce that reading has a lot to do with words. Thank you, researchers, for sharing that with us. Okay, so what is the kind of vocabulary students will face potentially on an exam like the HiSET? I was able to go to the HiSET practice exams that are available online for instructors and students to learn from. And I pulled out some words that came out of the very first passage on the practice HiSET exam. I literally just clicked the first passage, I read it, and these are the types of words that were embedded in that passage, the first one on the exam. Take a look at this list and think to yourselves, how many of my students actually know what these words mean? How many of my students are reading material that have these words in them? Or if not these words, words like this. These words represent what we call tier 2 vocabulary or academic vocabulary. These are words that come up in complex texts across all disciplines. You could be reading a newspaper, you could be reading a textbook, you could be reading a policy or a procedure at your job. And these are the kinds of words that will come up typically in that kind of instruction. Equally now, there's a lot of research a whole lot of research on the importance of knowledge as well, right? Vocabulary and knowledge go hand in hand. Words represent concepts, and concepts are the knowledge and is the knowledge that we have about our world and about everything around us. So there's a similar history of research that goes along with the vocabulary research that says not just vocabulary words matter, but also knowledge of different topics helps students read better. The more you know, the more you grow, right? And so let's take another look at the HiSET, same passage, and look at same practice test, but we're going to look at some of the topics that are represented by the passages on the HiSET. And here's just a quick, you can take a look and scan. You'll notice a whole range of topics. And this was, like I said, just this was maybe 3 or 4 passages from the HiSET where these things, these ideas are mentioned in the text students are reading. The law of contraries, I actually had to Google that. I had no idea what that was about. There was a passage or a mention of a bird, the robin, and a whole bunch of things about the anatomy of a robin and what they do in nature. A whole bunch of stuff here on the music industry. And there was another passage around the United States government and the court system and what these different entities do for our government. You can see just from this list of topics and references in the HiSET practice exam that there's an expectation that our students know a lot about a lot of things. And if you take this to take it away from the HiSET for a moment and think about, like I said, job training, there are a number of topics and references that students have to know to be successful in their trade and in their jobs as well. So this notion of building knowledge is so important, not just from a kind of college prep, community college prep, or GED prep, but also job prep. The knowledge you need is the knowledge you have to do your job. There's opportunities even in apprenticeships and trade programs to use literacy to build the necessary knowledge for good job performance as well. The connections here to the mandates that are coming at us from state programs and federal programs like WIOA have beautiful connections to college and career readiness and to the building of the necessary vocabulary and knowledge students need, not just for college, but for careers as well. All right, so everyone knows knowledge plays a big role in reading comprehension, but we're gonna explore just how big of a role it plays. So I'm gonna talk through an interesting study here. I do like to incorporate research as much as possible into any professional learning. We're all professionals, we're educators, and I think the more we understand the actual research behind some of the moves we make in our classrooms instinctually, just because we know it's good for students, it's nice to know that there's good, sound educational research to back up those ideas as well. This is probably one of my favorite studies. It's called the baseball study. The study was done years ago, and basically students were categorized in 4 categories for this study. They compared the reading comprehension of 4 different types of students. First, they took students who have demonstrated a high reading ability. They were normally high flyers in their classroom. They did good on reading tests and never seemed to have any real reading struggle. And they happened to also be students who knew a lot about baseball. So they asked them some questions and just got some basic knowledge about, okay, the student seems to know a lot about the sport. So that was the first category of the students in the upper left-hand quadrant, high reading ability and high knowledge of baseball. Then they took students who also had high reading ability, but knew very little about baseball. So they called them high reading ability, low knowledge of baseball. They had another group of students who demonstrated what they called low reading ability, meaning they were the students who were always in the bottom quartile of their class. They struggled on reading assessments, but they happened to know a lot about baseball. So they were the bottom left-hand corner of students with low reading ability, high knowledge of baseball. And the last group, naturally, then, are the students who were struggling readers and also did not know a lot about baseball. What they did was they gave all of these students a reading passage about baseball. They asked students to recall information from the passage. They had to answer some basic comprehension questions. They gave students access to those little figurines that you saw on the previous slide and asked them to reenact certain parts of the text that they were reading. And after all of that, they charted the results of how each of these groups of students did on this baseball test. I'm going to ask you now to pause the video and just take 5 minutes to go to the discussion board again. And I want you to tell me what your prediction is for which students did the best and rank them number 1, which students did second best and rank them number 2, which students did third best, and which students struggle the most with this test and rank them number 4. So you're going to say number 1 and either say it's the high reading, high knowledge kids or the high reading, low knowledge kids, or whichever you choose. Just take 5 minutes, go to the discussion board and give me your predictions, and then I'll come back and reveal the results of the assessment.